Coming up on this episode of Discover Health Podcast.
Women can have a lot of hormonal imbalances as a result of hitting their head. And they may not realize that that is kind of the original thing that started them either having really bad PMS symptoms or not being able to get pregnant or having early menopause. Like all of these hormonal things can actually be traced back to a brain injury. And that's a piece that is often completely ignored or not even looked at kind of by Western medicine.
Welcome to the Discover Health Podcast, where we explore the power of gut health, nutrition, and lifestyle to help you feel your best every day. I'm Dr. Josh Sharp, your guide on this journey to better digestion, more energy, and overall well-being. Ready to start discovering? Let's hit the trail. Welcome back to another episode of Discover Health Podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Joshua Sharp, and joining me today is a special guest, Dr. Ayla Wolf. She is a doctor of acupuncture and oriental medicine. She's a leading specialist in neurological rehabilitation, and she's the author of The Concussion Breakthrough: Discover the Missing Pieces to Recovery. She's a concussion survivor herself, and she now helps people around the world heal from post-concussion syndrome, traumatic brain injury, migraines, and dysautonomia through her clinic, Healing Response Acupuncture and Functional Neurology. And she's got a podcast, fellow podcaster. So thankful to meet another podcaster. Her podcast is called Life After Impact, the Concussion Recovery Podcast. Dr. Ayla, thank you so much for joining us today.
Yeah, thank you for having me.
So many practitioners, I say, have their own superhero backstory. Would you mind sharing with us what was it that led you to focus on concussions and neurological rehabilitation in the first place?
Yeah, my first 8 years of practice, I actually specialized in fertility. And so I helped people who wanted to grow their families. And that really led me to having kind of one foot in traditional Eastern medicine and one foot in functional medicine. I took a lot of courses and training in functional endocrinology and functional medicine. I worked alongside fertility clinics. And so that was kind of the first 8 years of my clinical practice. But during that time, I've always been very athletic and I've always done sports that were kind of solo sports, things like snowboarding, mountain biking, wakeboarding, and then martial arts. And so over the course of kind of probably my first concussion that I remember was when I was 18. I got kicked in the head at a karate tournament. And I just remember that was probably the only time where I lost consciousness, because all I remember is just coming to on the floor, having immediate nausea, headache, dizziness. And interestingly enough, I got up and I felt very disoriented and nobody around me seemed to notice anything was wrong. And so I kind of just wandered off the mat after losing my match and feeling just out of it. And I actually, at 18, had the wherewithal, that was on I think maybe a Friday night or a Saturday, to first thing Monday morning, go to my chiropractor and got adjusted. So yeah. So, I mean, I've been, doing kind of natural medicine and seeing chiropractors since I was 13. I was raised with the mindset of if something is wrong, like try something natural first before just running off to the doctor to take a pill. And so I grew up with a mindset of always knowing I was going to specialize in, something involving herbal medicine, natural health care. That was just how I was raised and how I've always been, raised to think is like, let's try the least invasive thing first. So fast forward, about 8 years into my practice, I had gotten to the point where I had had two concussions that were 10 days apart. One from a very kind of high impact mountain biking crash, and the other 10 days later where I was wakeboarding and I face planted and multiple times. And so none of these were incidences where I couldn't walk away from them. And so I think for me, I fall into that category of having been very active, having had a lot of head injuries with 25 years of martial arts history, lots of subconcussive impacts to the head. And so my post-concussion symptoms were maybe kind of like a very subtle right until that point where I had those two concussions 10 days apart. That's when I actually developed a temporary speech aphasia. I had to fly home and I had 3 legs to my airline flight. And I just remember, um, you know, feeling like I needed to eat something. I was at the airport and I went to grab a salad to go. And I just remember the person at the counter saying, "Do you want something to drink with that?" And I couldn't speak. I literally couldn't process in a way that allowed me to answer that question. And so I kind of just like shook my head and handed them a $20 bill and walked away. Like I didn't even want change. I was like, I can't interact with this person right now. And so I developed this kind of temporary speech aphasia. And also my working memory was just shot. And so I had a layover in Denver and I looked at the gate, the board with all the gate information and said, "Oh, you have to go to gate E5." I'm like, okay. So I turned around, I started walking towards the E terminal. And all of a sudden I was like, wait, what gate do I need to go to? 5 times I turned around and looked at the board, and suddenly I realized the only way I was gonna get to my gate was if I marched through the Denver airport chanting E5, E5, because my short-term memory, like my working memory was just shot. It was not working. And so that was the moment where I was like, "Okay, something's not right." And that led to really a long period of time of having a lot of cognitive symptoms in terms of brain fog, feeling very overwhelmed with a job that required me. I mean, I was in charge of a clinic that had 4 acupuncturists, 3 massage therapists, 2 locations, an entire medical billing staff. We were very busy, and I ran all of it while seeing patients full time. And so trying to do all of that with post-concussion syndrome was very, very difficult. And so I got to the point where I actually just got very depressed. I was very anxious. I wasn't sleeping. I decided to make a radical life decision and I sold everything. And I went back to school and I studied brain injuries and I got my doctorate degree. My entire thesis was doing a clinical trial on the use of acupuncture for improving blood flow to the brain, which we were measuring using transcranial Doppler ultrasound. And then I discovered the Carrick Institute, which teaches clinicians applied clinical neuroscience and neuro rehab. And so then for the last 10 years, I've basically been studying applied clinical neuroscience and doing functional neuro rehab in my clinic and specializing in helping other people to heal their brains from concussions and TBI.
Wow, there's a lot going on there. And you almost had your very own Home Alone 2 Lost in New York moment where you're in the airport. You don't know which gate. I mean, I could have seen you getting onto any number of planes. You could have ended up anywhere and never made it home. But we're thankful that you made it home. We're thankful that you made it to gate E5. And we're thankful that you decided to take what was a very difficult and probably a very scary time in your life and use that difficulty and then channel that to not only helping yourself but helping others with that experience. And I think so many great practitioners out there, they've got stories where not maybe they were a little interested in natural health, or maybe they were a little interested in certain healthy living things, but when they have their own struggle, then it really motivates them to, dive into it so deep. And then, those experiences end up helping others. And that's a beautiful thing. So glad that you did that. So if you can, thinking back to that early concussion, you got kicked in the head, looking back on that time now, were there symptoms that maybe were lingering around after that concussion? Were there difficulties as a kid that maybe you can point back and say, oh, yeah, I was probably struggling with some post concussion syndrome stuff between that concussion and your other two?
The biggest thing that I can look back and say was that I think with that very first concussion, it actually damaged my hearing in a way where when I was in busy environments, I couldn't hear the person in front of me. And so ever since I was 18, I just knew that if I was at a restaurant or a nightclub or a concert, whoever was standing right in front of me trying to have a conversation with me, I could never understand what they were saying. And at the time, I didn't understand that there are different aspects of hearing, and that would be considered how well can you distinguish from background noise and kind of that, the person in front of you. And so that was the function of my hearing that I had lost, the ability to kind of pull out certain sounds with a lot of background noise. And so that was something that um, never really healed. I still struggle with that. And what I learned in my research was that in the field of audiology, there are kind of clinical recommendations where audiologists, when they're doing a standard hearing test, should be assessing for whether somebody can still hear with different varying levels of background noise, but 50% of the time that's not being done. And so this is an aspect that I think gets missed a lot with concussion, is that people might be so focused on the headaches, the neck pain, the dizziness, things like that, that they can miss the hearing component. And so even when I was writing my book, I found a website that was a UK organization, but they have a free like background noise hearing test. And so I kind of put that free link in my book, but I was like, well, of course I'm going to take this test too. And sure enough, I failed it. So I think part of, why I enjoy a lot of spending one-on-one time with people is because when you get me in a room full of people all having conversations, still just don't, I don't love that because I struggle to hear and I have to think harder and it's harder to process things. So that is something that has stuck with me. Um, I would say, luckily, a lot of the kind of difficulty with focus and attention has improved significantly. So a lot of my cognitive symptoms have gone away, thank goodness. But that hearing piece is the one that has stuck with me.
Yeah, I think that there's probably a lot of listeners out there that would be surprised to hear, no pun intended on that one. They would be surprised to hear that hearing changes would be associated with brain injury, with a concussion, sports concussion. I think that there's a lot of people out there that really haven't made a connection like that. And so I think that's really powerful for people to hear. If you would talk to us about there's some obvious cases out there. And you mentioned you had some of your own, sports injury concussions with mountain biking, with water sports, things like that. But what are some of the under the radar, concussion injuries that maybe would happen on a more everyday scale that may go unnoticed?
Yeah, in my practice, I think because I am a female, my practice is heavily weighted towards women. And so what I have seen a lot is that, women in their 60s, 70s, 80s might have a slip. I live in Minnesota, so it's, icy here for half the year. So women might slip and fall on the ice and maybe they break a hip or they break a wrist, and the medical attention is more focused on the broken bone. And a lot of times in these cases, I find that people likely had a concussion and that gets completely missed because maybe the symptoms are more of like us, cognitively. This is what frustrates me, is that I feel like when people are in their 70s and 80s, if they start to have a cognitive decline, medicine is kind of like, oh, that's just you getting old. And there's a certain amount of like, oh, it's okay to have poor memory, or it's okay to suddenly not be able to function like you were. And there's almost this acceptance of like, this is a normal part of aging. But when it's actually from a concussion, you're missing a very important opportunity to actually do the recovery piece of it. And so I find time and time again, people have come to my office and they have, different symptoms like dizziness or cognitive symptoms. And when I start to ask them about a history, they will say, oh, I did have a fall and a slip on the ice, and or their family members will come to me and say something changed when they fell, or with car accidents too. That's a big one. I mean, most people have been in a car accident if you live long enough. And so that's a case where, again, a lot of people in their 40s, 50s, 60s, 70s maybe get in a car accident. The focus is on the neck injury or the whiplash, and the concussion piece gets missed. And so I think if we could implement, like, if everybody, we all have to like go to our, annual physical exams at the doctor. Like, I think everybody needs a cognitive test. And we should just do that every single year and just have it on record so that if anything happens in that year to our brains, we have a baseline of where we were operating with certain cognitive functions. Um, and I think people, when they think that, oh, this is some kind of intelligence test. And then they say, I don't want my intelligence tested. I don't want to know where my intelligence ranks. But it's not an intelligence test. It's simply testing different cognitive functions involving working memory, auditory memory, delayed memory, visual processing, balance. These aren't intelligence tests. These are just testing different aspects of cognitive function. And if we could all just have an annual cognitive test on record, I think that would be so important. If there was one thing I could change in medicine, that would be it.
When your drainage system backs up, your body cannot eliminate waste effectively, and that leaves you vulnerable to chronic inflammation and illness. Bowel Mover supports healthy elimination at the colon, keeping your drainage funnel flowing. Find it at discoverhealth.gethealthy.store. High quality supplements for real healing. And don't forget to use code FIRST10 for 10% off your first order. That makes so much sense. And I think when you're talking about with your practice, you treat naturally more women. I think that's because women are naturally a little smarter about, okay, there's something going on. There's something a little wrong. I need to do something about this. And men are more like, unless it's interfering with my ability to do my job or do my hobby, then I can just push through, and they're more likely to just try to ignore and push those things off. So good job, women. Men, get yourself checked, get your head checked a little bit. Nothing wrong with that. I think it could be very beneficial. And I love the idea that you're talking about of doing almost like a baseline cognitive assessment, almost just like a baseline series of neurological tests. And it doesn't have to be super complicated. It doesn't have to be super difficult. But then when you see differences or see changes, okay, now we can do something. Now, instead of waiting until it's so bad that you can barely function or you've got horrible, debilitating symptoms, you can take action sooner. Speaking
Yeah.
of horrible, debilitating symptoms, can you give us some of the symptoms that, I mean, obviously, headache or something might be there after a head injury, but what are some of the symptoms that would be likely to persist after a head injury or after a concussion that may be less noticeable or that people are more likely to just kind of gloss over or overlook?
Yeah. I will absolutely answer that question, but I did want to circle back. And, we talked about kind of this idea of slips and falls and car accidents. The other kind of demographic of women that I see are, the young athletes, the girls in sports. And so because females have longer necks and thinner necks, they are at more of a risk for concussions. And so a lot of like female soccer players, for example, or female hockey players, I've seen a number of like hockey, lacrosse, soccer, as far as like team sports, but also volleyball and basketball. You can get a lot of concussions in those sports. I've had a number of girls that just got hit in the face with a volleyball, and it turned into, massive kind of post-concussion syndrome. And then, of course, like the sports that I do, where there's no athletic trainer on the sideline when you're 15 miles into the woods on a mountain bike trail. And so there's a lot of sports like snowboarding and mountain biking. And then, of course, your equestrian sports. I don't know anybody who's a horseback rider who hasn't fallen off a horse. So that's one that you don't normally think of. And then, of course, like the cheerleading and the gymnastics are huge too. So I do also see a lot of teenagers that have had concussions and have really turned into kind of a chronic state of, headaches, neck pain, dysautonomia, maybe postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome, all kinds of, autonomic symptoms that cause more like light sensitivity, sound sensitivity, and make it so that going to school and being in school is really difficult. So, so there's definitely like these, on the spectrum of ages. I work with women of all ages, and I find that with my background in fertility and women's hormones, when you talk about like what are some of the maybe subtle symptoms that people might not connect the dots, the brain is the orchestrator of our hormones. And so when you get a concussion or a brain injury, all of a sudden that can lead to hormonal problems down the road. Women can have a lot of hormonal imbalances as a result of hitting their head. And they may not realize that that is kind of the original thing that started them either having really bad PMS symptoms or not being able to get pregnant or having early menopause. Like all of these hormonal things can actually be traced back to a brain injury. And that's a piece that is often completely ignored or not even looked at kind of by Western medicine.
Yeah, I totally agree. So I personally believe there's loads and loads of people out there that have had concussions during their younger years, had concussions maybe in childhood, maybe as a teenager, maybe even as a young adult, never had it checked out, never had it assessed. It was never dealt with. Is it too late for them, 10, 12, 15 years down the road? Is it too late for them to make improvements in cognitive function and to heal their brain?
It's never too late. We used to say that, once someone got to a certain age that their brain was just kind of hardwired and they, we used to think you can't teach an old dog new tricks. And that is so inaccurate and wrong. People can learn new things at any age. And honestly, the best way to preserve brain health as people age is to learn new things, to learn new routines, to learn a new language, to learn how to play an instrument, to, just learn how to move their bodies in a different new way. These are the things that actually keep us younger, keep our brains younger. They've done interesting studies about people who move, who like pick up their life and move to a different state or a different country, and just having to relocate and learn an entire new city or new town and how to drive in a new place and learn where everything is. That creates a massive amount of neuroplasticity that's actually protective in the long run. So the idea that you turn 65 and you retire and then you sit on the couch and just watch TV, that's like the worst thing you could do for your brain health,
Yeah.
for sure. But so those are kind of some of the things. I didn't fully answer your question about like what are some of these other symptoms that people can have. M- and the way that I structured my book was I think when people do think about brain injuries, they do think like symptomatically. And so I did categorize my book as far as like an entire chapter on post-traumatic headaches and how those might be different from migraine, a chapter on traumatic neck injuries and the overlap between a neck injury and concussion symptoms. I have a whole chapter on the autonomic nervous system. I get into a whole chapter on different aspects of cognitive function, because when I got my concussions, my background was in fertility. I didn't know anything about the brain or neuroscience. And so even being able to just have the language to describe symptoms from a cognitive perspective or a vestibular perspective, I really wanted to give people the tools to communicate in my book. And so being able to understand how like vision and eye movements are two different things. When people get a concussion, they might go to their doctor. Their doctor says, well, your visual acuity is fine. Your eye prescription hasn't changed. But if they don't do a deep dive into eye movements, they might miss the fact that your two eyes are no longer working together. And so then all of a sudden the person says, well, I went to my eye doctor. They said nothing had changed and I was fine. And then when I do a deep dive into looking at their eye movements, I see there's all kinds of things that aren't working appropriately that are likely driving their cognitive symptoms and their headaches and their neck tension and all of that. the book is kind of divided into those main categories, and then, like I said, like the dizziness and the balance issues are a whole chapter, sleep dysfunction, and then mood changes too. I think a lot of people might not recognize that their irritability or their difficulty with processing or multitasking, those are some things that are kind of subtle that people might not put two and two together of like, oh, I had a concussion and then all of a sudden I developed a lot of issues with focus and attention and I get overwhelmed really easily. I hear a lot of parents say, I used to have much more patience with my children, and now I got a concussion, and everything my kid does, I'm just immediately irritated and frustrated, and they feel guilty, like they don't want to feel that way.
Right.
And so the brain injury is the thing that is preventing them from actually really enjoying their kids, and they feel terrible about that, and it breaks my heart when I hear women say that. And luckily there are things we can do to help with that.
Well, I think you made some really good points there, and I like how you broke it down and you sectioned it out. But one of the things that I love is you give hope. You give hope for people whether they had a concussion recently, whether that was years ago. Something can be done. It doesn't have to be this way forever. You don't have to stay stuck there forever. And so I think that's a message that a lot of people really need to hear. If somebody is thinking, I did have some issues. Fell off my bike and I have struggled with different issues ever since then, or maybe they have symptoms that they're not there all the time, but as you pointed out with eye movements, and it's really cool whenever you have a patient that notices this on their own, like, well, when I look this certain direction, I feel dizzy or my vision changes, and then they finally start to associate that and get checked out. When people are noticing that stuff, what is the best way that they could be assessed? What do you think are the best tools to assess and figure out what's actually going on? And where are some of the best places where you could find those tools to be assessed and figure out actually what's going on and what level of damage is there in the brain?
Yeah. So that kind of brings us back to what you had asked about earlier, which is, okay, if somebody had a concussion a long time ago, might they still be experiencing some symptoms? And the reality is that our brain is very, very intelligent in its ability to compensate. And so if somebody had a concussion, like from early childhood or maybe in their 20s, and they never really got checked out, maybe they developed an eye movement disorder and their brain just kind of created a workaround for that for a really long period of time. And so then, like you said, they might come in and they might have these really specific things that they say about, well, gosh, whenever I'm looking off and to the left, I suddenly get dizzy. I have people that will give me very specific examples, like when you're driving and you have to look over your left shoulder to check your blind spot. I have patients that say, as soon as my eyes go to the left or I try to turn my head to the left, all of a sudden I get a moment of dizziness and now I don't feel safe driving. Or, they have very specific real world examples of what they're doing and how that causes a weird symptom. And so in terms of getting that checked out, if people have been compensating for a long time, what they really need to find is somebody who understands the integration between their visual system, their vestibular system, their proprioceptive system, like information coming from their neck and their ankles regarding balance, even their jaw, and understand how to test them in these real world scenarios. Because a lot of people, if you just test their eyes in isolation, maybe things look normal, but then all of a sudden you test their eye movements when their head is like tilted back and to the left, and everything falls apart. They can't follow a pursuit anymore. Or maybe, you are looking at someone's balance and their balance is great, but then all of a sudden you ask them to do math equations while they're trying to balance with their eyes closed and they start falling over. So in order to, that's where the whole functional neurology piece comes
Mhm.
in, and that functional mindset of, let's not just look at how someone can walk down the hall and back. Let's have them say every other letter of the alphabet out loud while they walk. And so maybe someone can walk down the hall just fine, turn around and come back. But then when I have them dual task with an activity and they have to think, all of a sudden they start falling over, they start freezing, their arm swing stops and their arms are frozen. Sometimes you'll see them like cross their legs over and they have this kind of like Victoria's Secret runway model gait that kicks in, and you see their gait completely change just because they were thinking and walking at the same time. And so you have to put people in these kind of unique scenarios to say, well, your eyes can like follow a pursuit when your head is straight forward, but if I turn your head to the left, now all of a sudden you can't. Now we know that there's some kind of issue with how your neck and your visual system are not working together. So that's really where that functional neurology model comes in, and we just start asking questions. One of my mentors, Dr. Antonucci, who's brilliant, brilliant man, he said on his first appointment with patients, he says to them, "Today I'm not Dr. Antonucci, I'm Detective Antonucci." So he really is like, today I'm a detective. I'm going to just like run you through a bunch of tests. And if I see something, I'm going to follow that rabbit hole and maybe do a few other tests that aren't normally in the program. Right. And so I love that idea of being a detective first, because concussions are so complex. It's one of the most complex injuries somebody can have, because everybody is completely different in terms of how their brain was injured, how their brain is trying to compensate. Um, a lot of people, when you get a concussion, it doesn't happen in a vacuum. You might have 45 years of a health history, before the concussion. And so I've had people that, they come to me after their third concussion and they also have Lyme disease, or they have an autoimmune
Hmm.
condition, or, they have PTSD from a completely separate incident. And so people are not coming to me with this like clean slate and then a brain injury. That's never the case.
Right.
And so you've got to be able to have that functional approach that treats everybody as an individual and says, how is this individual person compensating, or where are their struggles? And how do I create a treatment plan that is highly individualized for what that person needs? There's no protocol. There's no concussion protocol when it comes to people with kind of persistent post-concussion syndrome.
Yeah, that makes sense. And I personally love the idea of functional tests myself. Put them through the paces and see what they can do. We thankfully have a really good understanding of what the body and the brain should be able to do, coordination and balance and all the stuff. And whenever you put it under stress, or I shouldn't say stress, but whenever you make it
Hmm.
work, make it do work, sometimes that can reveal itself, and that can be very, very beneficial. And a lot of times things will show up in a functional test in office that may not show up on traditional imaging, or it may not show up with just your average, like you talked about, eye doctor test or something like that. And so I think that is a great way to assess people, and finding someone that does that functional testing like that, and that has kind of a functional neurological background, I think is a great idea. So I love that thought process. In terms of treatments, in terms of healing, what have you found are some of the most powerful and effective therapies out there to help people kind of undo this damage and retrain these neural pathways?
Yeah, I've been doing this for 10 years, and one of the most profound shifts was recognizing, um, you can learn how the whole system is wired, and you can learn how to test somebody and say, okay, maybe they're having a problem with convergence eye movements, or maybe when their head is tilted back into the right, they get dizzy or they lose their balance. You can learn how to test all of these individual sensory systems as a kind of separate system. But when it comes to people that have had symptoms for a very long time, the thing that really seems to move the needle the most is really working on sensory integration and giving people rehab that asks their brain to do a lot of things all at one time. And so, I've had a great example. I had somebody come in and she had a concussion. Here we are 3 years later. She still has a lot of cognitive symptoms. Her balance really breaks down when she's tired, and it's worse at the end of the day. She basically kind of quit doing yoga, and she had gone to a vestibular PT who like just worked on balance. And they were like, well, when we test your balance is great. So like, we're going to just, say you don't need to come in. And so what happened was, when I saw her, I started to test her balance when there were other things going on, right? Whether that's like distracting music playing, or when she's having to do math and balance at the same time, or, it's like all of a sudden I started to see where her balance would break down. And so her therapy involved balance activities while simultaneously doing eye movement activities like an anti-saccade eye exercise, or having to move her arms in a certain way while thinking about cities that start with the letter A, or it's like we had to start pulling in cognitive tasks with distractions, with balance, with having to kind of change the rule set of what she was supposed to focus on. And so it was being able to recognize that if somebody has a balance issue, sometimes the solution is not, oh, just practice balance. It's having to pull in these other brain areas and get everything to kind of activate at the same time in order to rewire the brain and create better sensory integration. And so once I really saw the beauty in the ability to do that, people started to get better faster. So sometimes it's like if you see, oh, someone can't follow a pursuit very well, the solution might not just be let's practice following pursuits, right? Like, so we have to be able to think about how do we get into that system through different pathways. And so once I started really thinking that way, I became much more helpful in doing some of this neuro rehab type work.
Yeah. So sensory integration, what other type of modalities have you found are, really effective, or what other type of things are a nice adjunct or a nice add-on to doing the sensory integration?
Yeah. So, as somebody with a Chinese medicine background, there are situations in which acupuncture can be very helpful. So, when somebody has poor joint position sense of their neck, so we can pop a laser on somebody, or we have these glasses that have a laser in the middle, and we can kind of turn their head off of a target, and with their eyes closed, they have to try to like get the laser back on the dot. So we can test people's ability to know kind of how fast and how far their head is moving. And if they have poor joint position sense of their neck, I often find that acupuncture can really help to kind of remap that and help with that. Acupuncture also can help with improving blood flow to the brain. And so I'll never forget, there was one time I used to be the team acupuncturist for some of the UFC fighters. And I had a guy show up to my clinic. He had just had a fight 2 days before. And he, like, his saccade eye movements were very, very slow, very sluggish. And after just doing an acupuncture treatment, boom, they were like, it was crazy how much better they were. And I think that, the thing that happened was basically we just helped to restore blood flow after he had had, some insults to his head from the MMA fight 2 days before. And so sometimes acupuncture has actually surprised me because I do the neurological tests before the treatment. So I know how things are functioning. And
Hmm.
sometimes to this day, I'm still surprised that I can do acupuncture, and then all of a sudden it's like, oh wow, like their balance is better, or their eye movements are better, or what's going on. And so I do think that by just sometimes simply improving the blood flow and the circulation to the brain, acupuncture is a very gentle way of doing that. I'm a big proponent of craniosacral therapy and osteopathic manipulation. I do use kind of transcranial photobiomodulation, so using red light therapy in my practice. I've got a PEMF device too. I think those can be very
Hmm.
helpful. And then when it comes to things like dysautonomia, um, with dysautonomia, and I'll take like postural orthostatic tachycardia syndrome as an example. Um, when people have POTS, there are different reasons for the POTS. There's different reasons why the heart rate shoots up really high when someone stands up. So there's hyperadrenergic POTS where people, when they stand up, they're actually they're releasing excessive amounts of norepinephrine. And so they're having this like excessive sympathetic response to being upright. In that case, from a Chinese medicine perspective, I would give people a very different formula So if someone is having an increased sympathetic activity when they stand up, I would give that person a very different herbal formula than somebody who has hypovolemic POTS, where because they have low blood volume, they stand up and then their heart tries to pound faster to just get more fluid pumping to get that blood to the brain. And so a hypovolemic POTS would require a very different treatment than a hyperadrenergic POTS. So that's kind of an example of like how I can use Chinese medicine in a very specific way to address certain aspects of dysautonomia.
Well, that makes a lot of sense what you're saying. For people that may have, figured out, or maybe they've realized, okay, there's probably some post-concussion syndrome issues that I'm dealing with. What are some things that they could be focusing on at home on their own to try to improve or at least minimize the inflammation going on there in the brain?
Um, I think that one of, we are a country that loves to take pills. And so I do think that there is a lot of people that if they have some kind of like concussion symptoms, they go online and they start Googling like what supplements can I take or what pills can I take. And I would say that there are certain nutrients that can be important for people, like especially with women, magnesium is huge, right? Magnesium deficiencies are very widespread. So there are certain like nutrients that are helpful, like essential fatty acids and magnesium, but there's also a lot of supplements that probably aren't going to move the needle for somebody as much as having an anti-inflammatory diet, cutting out exposure to like glyphosate and all these chemicals, and then also exercise. I mean, it's like the things that really move the needle as far as longevity and brain health and toning the autonomic nervous system. Exercise is huge, right? And so being able to get regular movement in, being able to eliminate, like I said, kind of exposure to glyphosate and a lot of inflammatory foods and processed food, those things are huge. Making sure people have like regular sleep schedules and practicing the sleep hygiene. It's all of the not sexy stuff, the sleep, the exercise, the
Mhm.
healthy eating, like those have to be there as a foundation before trying to like solve problems through popping pills, basically.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. Okay, we talked about what are some of the good things people could do. What are some of the worst things that you could do for your brain at home? What are things we should avoid?
Sure. Well, I mean, alcohol is probably the best way to throw gasoline on the fire. So that's one of them. And so alcohol, processed foods, like just trying to cut a lot of that out. Um, some people, I think I think just our regular exposure to like household chemicals, some people aren't necessarily thinking about. And so you walk into their house and they've got like the Tide Pods and the Glade plugins and this, fake scented candles. And sometimes it's like our own house is just like a petri dish of synthetic chemicals. I think, it's a good strategy to try to slowly kind of eliminate that and just make the household a place of like get air purifiers, replace your furnace filter, like think about air quality, think about water quality, the water you're drinking, is it filtered? Or, are you just drinking your city water that's got a bunch of nasty stuff in it? And so some of the basic things of like clean air, clean water, clean food, all of that's really important. And getting outside, just I live out in the country for a reason, and I just know that it's very healing to my brain and my nervous system to be able to just play in my garden and play in the dirt, and so those things are huge.
I totally agree. And it makes so much sense. And that I agree with what you said. Those aren't the fun things or the exciting things. That's not there's like a laser brain, a brain laser that we can use to heal my brain. It's like, that can help, but it's not going to undo all the, alcohol and, all the other damaging things that you're doing. Those are the things that are going to make the biggest difference long term. And then those other therapies can be super helpful, obviously, but they need to be there alongside taking care of yourself and taking care of your brain. So that makes a lot of sense. Dr. Wolf, if somebody wanted to check out your book or learn more about you and your clinic and what you're doing, where could they find those things?
Sure. So lifeafterimpact.com is my website that has information on my book and links to all my podcast episodes. I didn't realize my book was 600 pages because I just kept like writing chapters and sending them off to the publisher. And so when I realized it was 600 pages, I went, oh boy, a lot of people with brain injuries are not going to want to read a 600-page book. And so that's why I started the podcast. And so the podcast was my way of just talking about a lot of the information that's in the book. And then the opportunity for me to just sit down with a lot of the brilliant functional neurology practitioners that I'm honored to call my colleagues. And so I've been able to pull in a lot of amazing clinicians and researchers and just people with their own stories and journeys on that podcast. So all of that is at lifeafterimpact.com or on Instagram at lifeafterimpact. And then my book is on Amazon. So people can find it on Amazon there. And then there's a symptom survey that's in chapter 1 of my book that's actually on my website. So if people wanted to take that survey, it's free, and it does all the math calculations for you, and then it emails you your results. And so if you go to my website and click on Start Here, you can take that symptom survey, and then that will let people know that, you know, if you score really high in this one category, that all that information is covered in like chapter 4 of the book. So I did that so that people didn't feel like they had to read that whole book cover to cover. And then my clinic, which is located on kind of the border of Minnesota and Wisconsin in Stillwater, my website is healingresponseneuro.com. And so that's where I do all my clinical work.
That's great. Dr. Wolf, thank you so much for taking the time to join us today. I will put links to your website, your book, and everything that you mentioned right below this episode in the podcast description. If you're listening on audio, it'll be right below this episode. If you're watching on YouTube, it's going to be in the YouTube description below this video. Again, thank you so much for taking the time to join us. And one final quick question. Who is the person that needs to be taking that quiz? Like, who is going to be the person that you would encourage, like, yeah, definitely take this quiz to figure out if this could be an issue for you?
I would say anybody who has a known or suspected concussion where they feel like they didn't heal in the expected, like 2 to 4 week window of time that people say you're supposed to heal in. Anybody that feels like they have lasting symptoms could take that quiz and figure out if there's more information that maybe they need to look into as far as what is going on, what systems do I need to be concerned about, who should I go to get assessed. So that quiz kind of helps people to figure out what's the next step.
That's great. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks for tuning in to the Discover Health podcast. Remember, your health is a journey, not a destination. Keep exploring, and we'll see you next week.